Linda agus a ghiniú sreta anhasar bheith seo, mar go dtugann siad eistem lé a dhéanamh agus beidir ar ggóiltí a dhéanamh nach bhfuil ró politically correct mar dheartha. When I come to reflect about issues of reform, I have to say I'm a bit of a sceptic. Not a Eurosceptic, maybe a Hiberno-sceptic, but I'm a sceptic about the way the argument about reform is frequently conducted. And without being polemical about it, I have to say Matt has just given us a particularly clear example of that. I agree with the emphasis that he put on how decisions should be made as closely as possible to the people who are affected by them, what's called in the European jargon the principle of subsidiarity, which was one of the things argued about in the run-up to the Lisbon Treaty. And he also talked about decentralising or removing powers from the European Union and devolving them back to member states. You remember the UK government, Prime Minister Cameron, is very strong on this. The interesting thing is, and you can check this out on the very excellent IIEA website, that the British government has engaged with European authorities and other member states in quite a detailed discussion of where powers might be redevolved back to the member states. And the results have been rather unimpressive. They have found very little that they think could usefully be redevolved back to member states. Now, that may well be because the British already have a series of opt-outs from parts of the treaty. But, you know, there's much more to this process. It's not as simple as it's sometimes referred to. Again, when I think about reform, I ask, what is it we want to reform and what resources do we have to carry out that reform? And, you know, I know this is going to put me in a very conservative, stick-in-the-mud light. I remember part of our old Tagus Christi Namrahra Christula. It had a definition of original sin. And I said, we have original sin because our minds are darkened, our will is weakened, and our nature inclines us to evil. And that's the human condition. 9 times out of 10, we humans can be relied on to make a mess of some of what we do, because we're not that terribly wise about a lot of it. And the reform very often takes the line of saying that we have to reduce the power of elites, do away with the centrality of elites and get things back into the hands of the people. Because the elites are people who are disconnected from the public. They don't understand public interests. They live in a bubble and they are far too influenced by the powerful influences of multinational corporations, etc., etc. You can write all the rest. And I just wonder what, in God's name, I've been doing for the last 35 years, because I have been one of those people who could be defined as one of the elite for those 35 years. So it must be that all of the ordinary people, or those that I think are ordinary, that I meet at the MacGill Summer School, that I used to meet in politics in my own constituency, that I used to meet in politics and voluntary organisations all around this country and other countries, all those people I met must have been part of the same bubble that I was in, you know. And I think that when we discuss reform, we don't really concentrate on what it is we want to do with reform. Again, the context, I think, is sometimes skewed. I agreed with a great deal of what Rory said. But at the back of my mind, I have the need to complete the picture. Rory's pointed out that trust in the European Parliament has been declining over a period. It has indeed. Trust in national parliaments has been declining over a period from indeed a lower base. I think it's common throughout the European Union and indeed outside it that there's a secular tendency to decline in the rate of participation in elections. And all of that actually predates the latest financial crisis. It predates a lot of the political upheavals that we've seen in the last decade. So there is something there that we need to be concerned about, but it's not peculiar to the European Union. It's not peculiar to Irish politics or to UK politics. There is something more general behind that. And I find that that line of discussion about reform very often ends up, as indeed Rory did, with the suggestion that we need to find ways of giving voters, of giving the public, means of being more involved. Personally, and I'm not getting polemical about it, I find that idea of giving people more opportunities to be involved is rather kind of condescending. People should take it. And that resonates with me, with something that a participant in this discussion today, whom I won't name in this room, said to me earlier on this afternoon. And I quote, "Irish people elect Egypts," which indeed they do. More elegantly, it's said, people get the government they deserve. And I think that the kind of discourse that we have tends far too often to remove responsibility from the electorate for the choices they make and hand it over to the political system. Now, I don't think it's any accident, as I've said, that disenchantment, as it's sometimes called, or distrust with political systems is much more widespread than we seem to think when we talk about the European Union. I can't think of any electoral system anywhere in the European Union, or indeed wider than that, where people will say that they are actually happy with their government in a majority, except shortly after elections, or happy with their electoral system. And my conclusion, I have to say, is that the problems that we have are not so much with the electoral system, first past the post, our own system of multi-choice PR, list systems, whatever. No matter what system you look at, you will find countries where people are disenchanted with politics, where they don't think their electoral system is good, and where they would like to change it. And I very much suspect that even if you changed it, you wouldn't get any greater degree of happiness with the system. And it all speaks to me of the need not to give people more opportunities for involvement, but for people themselves to take opportunities for involvement in their political systems. And that is very often reflected in the kind of discussion that happened here, indeed, earlier in this week. And I was reading reports of the discussion yesterday, where again there was a very strong feeling coming through that, although the terms were different, that people need to take more control in the way they go about their politics. The kinds of reforms that we need, again, we need to be, I think, a little bit clearer in how we define those reforms. The difficulties with reform, I think, have been very aptly demonstrated by Matt just now, who said one of the reforms we want in the European Union is that we want, when decisions are made, we would like in Ireland to have decisions made in ways and about things that are particularly important, peculiar to us. That's not an Irish trait. It's not a peculiarly Irish trait. That's the way it happens when all decisions are made in the European Union. And by and large, the result of that is that the important decisions that are made have aspects that please everybody and have certain aspects that please only some people and hugely displease the others. And that's the process of give and take that you will have when you have any joint enterprise, as the European Union is. I don't think we will ever have a system where all of the decisions that come out are accepted in all their details by every participating member state. Now, I won't go any further than that into the reasons for being sceptical about reform, but what I'm doing is making an argument for being a good bit more specific about what we mean by reform than the debate tends to be. And in truth, the European Union is actually not very bad at reform. It's been, one way or another, in existence for 63 years. In those 63 years, it has had 5 major waves of reform, beginning with the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty and coming up to our latest Lisbon Treaty. So it does reform reasonably well, although it tends to do it rather slowly. I would argue, and I think Rory mentioned this, there has actually been, in relative terms, more fundamental institutional reform in the European Union in those 63 years than there has been in almost any one of its member states, with the possible exception of Germany. And when you look at some of the things that could be regarded as reform in the European Union, many of them have been truly revolutionary, and I would give as just one example of that the 2004 accession expansion to include the former satellite states of the European Union. That was a political reform at European level of major proportions. So there we have, I would make the point, a European Union that has shown, indeed, a great capacity for reform, but that reform needs to be defined, it needs to be guided, its direction needs to be specified. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that the process of reform in the European Union, no more than in any member state, is very often slow and tedious. And the political leadership of the European Union hasn't been particularly noteworthy for its foresight or for its wisdom. Neither, indeed, has the European Council nor the European Commission. Neither of those can claim to have seen the financial crisis coming. The European Parliament can't claim to have seen the financial crisis coming. But again, the European Union is not alone in this. The United States authorities were taken as much by surprise. The UK authorities were taken by surprise by this. And indeed, going back a bit further than that, the leaders of the Asian Tigers were taken by surprise when their financial crisis happened. The glaring difference, though, in the EU, in my mind, was the tardiness of the response. The financial crisis actually took hold in 2007. Not even 2008, as people think, but it started well back in 2007. The full force of the implosion became apparent in the autumn of 2008. It wasn't until the spring of 2010, for example, that the European Union authorities, the European Council, the European Central Bank and the Commission were able to agree to take any action in relation to Greece. It took them that long to agree that they needed to do something about Greece. And it took them a further year to agree on the debt restructuring package that actually was put in place in Greece. In fact, I happen to know the person who chaired that particular discussion about debt restructuring in Greece, and he told me that it was the most miserable year he had ever spent in all of his life. And by the time that restructuring was agreed, the markets had already anticipated most of the effect of it, and it didn't have the same fundamental effect that they hoped it would have. The European Central Bank was very slow to move. At one point, after the full extent of the crisis had been revealed, the European Central Bank actually increased interest rates in the face of falling economic activity in the member states. An incredible reaction in most people's minds. The European Central Bank didn't commence its, what they call their LTRO operations, pumping liquidity into the system, until early in 2012. The European Council dithered until 2012 before expressing its determination to break the doom loop that linked banks, toxic banks, ailing banks, with sovereign borrowers. The jury is still out, I have to say, on the question of whether they've succeeded in doing that. It took the advent of a new president in the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, to succeed against German opposition in announcing that that bank would do whatever it takes to get out of the crisis, principally by means of what he calls outright monetary transactions. So far, it appears that the promise of OMT, as he calls it, appears to have been effective. We don't know, if push ever comes to shove, whether it will in fact have the effect that it's intended to have. But in the meantime, the European Central Bank has brought its prime rate down to historically low levels, to the point where interest rate operations are no longer an effective weapon in the armoury of the European Central Bank. It's been used to the full extent that it can possibly be. There's nothing else to be done there. The other means of action available to the European Central Bank, and here's an area where we do need to look at reform, the other means of action available to it are regarded with suspicion by German, Dutch, Swedish and Finnish authorities, and maybe the German Constitutional Court, we still have to find out the full truth on that, as being perilously close to what they regard as the cardinal sin of monetary financing. And that brings us, in my view, to the real core of the policy problems in today's European Union. The initial approach to the Greek problem, and the reason that it took so long to decide to do anything about it, was to consider it as a fiscal policy problem. It wasn't until the magnitude of the debt problem in Greece began to be appreciated that the issue of restructuring began to be addressed. Now, the original analysis clearly was skewed by the fact, by the realisation that Greek fiscal policy before the onset of the crisis had indeed been grossly irresponsible, and that they had royally cooked the books in making a case for entering into the euro in the first place. However, the problem was viewed as being basically a fiscal problem, and particularly for the member states that had problems other than Greece. The Irish government then shocked its EU partners in September 2008 by giving an unprecedented bank guarantee. And just to inform a little the debate on burning bondholders and so on, the Irish government bank guarantee was given without any reference to bailing in bondholders. It took Ireland's European partners by surprise, and once the guarantee had been given in the terms in which it was given, it was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, even if everybody agreed to burn bondholders, to go back on the guarantee that had been given. It was an unsolicited guarantee, and it created a position from which it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to retreat. But even then, that government, I'm not being politically partisan in saying this, that government took some time, indeed well into 2009, to realise that there was a financial sector problem rather than just a fiscal problem. We had a financial sector problem that had dramatic fiscal effects. It wasn't realised then just how deep the financial sector problem was, and indeed it wasn't until the September of 2010 that any attempt was made to assess what the real depth and extent of the financial sector problem was, and that external support was needed. When it came, it took the form of the Troika, and the Troika arrangement was essentially and principally conditional on fiscal measures, and it appears, and we may learn more about this, it appears that any substantial measure of debt restructuring was ruled out. Having said that, I just remind you that I believe that the terms of the original guarantee given in September 2008 actually made it easier to rule out debt restructuring than it might have been without it. But the problem was considered by European authorities to be fundamentally a fiscal problem and to be sorted out by fiscal action. It then became apparent that there were serious flaws in the structure of the Eurozone. And although there are many people around who pointed to what they regarded as flaws in the Eurozone arrangements in the Maastricht Treaty, they didn't point out what the flaws actually were that gave rise to the problem that we saw. But those flaws meant that the obsession with fiscal policy resulted in the worst flaws, the most difficult flaws, being the last to be dealt with. The fiscal obsession meant that much of the debate on the banking dimension at EU level was conducted on the basis of the belief that only borrowers are irresponsible. I think anybody who looks deeply into the operations of the financial sector will know that for every irresponsible borrower, there is an irresponsible lender. And I think one of the issues that I hope our new inquiry into banking structures will look at is how people saw risk in the period between, say, 2004 and 2008. After a very difficult debate and a referendum here, the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance was passed. It was previously known as the Fiscal Compact. It was signed in March 2013. It came into effect on the 1st of January of this year, 5 years, over 5 years after the emergence of the crisis. It took precedence over measures to deal with future banking crises, not the existing one. We have a single supervisory mechanism for banks. It was finally agreed by the European Parliament in September of last year. It comes into effect in November this year. And we more recently had agreement on a single resolution mechanism. That, to my mind, is unlikely to be of any real use in addressing any new banking crisis that might happen before the contributions to be made by still ailing banks to resolution funds have reached an adequate level, and that, in my view, will take some years. Negotiation of that fiscal compact, in my view, took up political time and energy that would more productively have been devoted to seeking a speedier resolution of the banking crisis. Friends of mine, including some of those in the Institute of European Affairs, who would have regarded me in the past as a kind of a fiscal hawk, were surprised to hear me saying that the fiscal compact was the most useless, pointless treaty I have ever seen at a European level. It's going to have no effect whatsoever for years. Just imagine that we reached the nirvana state that that compact aims at. All the member states have structural budget deficits of less than 0.5% of GDP. Their debt levels are less than 60% of GDP. This is heaven for the fiscal compact hawks. And if you assume that, and then assume that there is a non-financial economic asymmetric shock that affects, maybe has big effects on maybe 4 member states, 1 big one and 3 small ones, and not so much on the others, what happens? The affected member states can only put another 0.5% of GDP on their deficit. They can't increase their debt levels. So they're stuck. The member states that are not affected, even if they want to help, can't do it. They can't put another 0.5% onto their deficit, and they can't increase their debt levels. The result is that whatever problem is going to be there lasts for longer than it needs to. And that's been exactly the case in the European Union and in the Eurozone ever since the crisis hit in 2007 and since it became really severe in 2008. So reform, I'll come to the end. Reform needs to be defined, its objectives need to be set out clearly, and what we're reforming has to be something that's worth reforming. Some of the stuff that we need to reform, I think, like the Fiscal Compact, we could better do without. At the end, what do we need to do? We need, perhaps more than any of the other things that are talked about, to reform the way decisions are made by the 28 member states of the European Union. It's a difficult thing to do. All of these decisions are extremely difficult, and they hit on sensitive areas. But I'm always struck by 2 things. Number one, we've agreed in the European Union to do extremely difficult and sensitive things together. Trade policy is completely in the hands of the European Union. We have a single market in the European Union. That's very important and a mark very often of national sovereignty. We don't have a common foreign policy. People say we shouldn't have, and we hear the debate even today on why does the Irish government not stand up more to Israel about Gaza, and what influence could the Irish government have. But reflect on this. If in the year 2003 we had had, God between us and all harm, as the opponents would say, if we'd had qualified majority voting on foreign policy in 2003, this is one example, the United Kingdom would not have been able to participate in the invasion of Iraq. I think that might have been a good thing. And if we got a European Union that could do that kind of thing for us, wouldn't it be worth reforming to get there? Thank you.